Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Next up, we have Juliana Mulligan. Juliana has been an active member of the Ibogaine community for 8 years and holds a bachelor's in psychology. She has worked in 3 Ibogaine clinics trained under Dr. Andrew Tatarsky and is a certified EMT. Under her current business, Inner Vision Ibogaine, she works therapeutically with people, supporting them in preparation for and integration after Ibogaine treatment. Previously, she was an opioid-dependent person for 7 years, during which she served time in county jail, experienced overdoses, was homeless, and tried most mainstream forms of treatment. In 2011, with the help of Ibogaine, she left opioids behind. Although her treatment was a success, the clinic was practicing unsafely, and she narrowly survived 6 cardiac arrests and 2 weeks on a pacemaker in the ICU. This experience led her to focus much of her work on safety and proper clinical practice. She is also currently working to create new systems of accountability and responsibility amongst Ibogaine practitioners. She has been featured in Double Blind Magazine, Women's Day Magazine, and Psymposia. Juliana, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really grateful to be presenting at this conference about Ibogaine. I just want to make sure, is my audio and video working okay?
Yep, you're great.
Okay. Yeah, so as he just said, I've got 8 years of experience working in the Ibogaine community. I'm also currently the psychedelic program coordinator for the Center for Optimal Living in New York. And besides having extensive experience about Ibogaine, I'm really interested in working on issues in the Ibogaine community and issues in the psychedelic community at large, mainly issues of intersectionality, dealing with racism, classism, accessibility. These are issues that don't often get talked about enough in the community. The psychedelic world is predominantly a white, male, and affluent community. And so because we're approaching healing with psychedelics, we really need to talk about the climates that people live in and not just focus on the healing of a certain demographic. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about, giving like a little intro to Ibogaine treatments, talking about my story. I want to talk about some issues in the community also, and just some social issues in general about the Ibogaine community and the psychedelic community at large. So it's going to be a little bit of both, and I have some slides for the beginning, but then the second half I'm mainly going to be bringing up some points for discussion and then taking questions from people. Okay, let me go to screen share one moment. Okay. All right. So, yep, this is a photo that I took in Gabon. I went there 2 years ago, and I was able to watch 4 different ceremonies done in 4 different villages. There's kind of like, there's a history of Iboga and where it comes from, and then there's an Ibogaine history. Just to give like a little intro about Iboga and where it comes from, it's primarily been used in Gabon and Cameroon for thousands of years. There's no really sure dates. It's used as a part of a religion called Bwiti that's practiced there. There's like a legend of how it was discovered by a woman who had hunted a porcupine and ate the porcupine. The porcupine had apparently eaten Iboga. The woman went into a trance that her husband couldn't wake her from, discovered she had eaten the porcupine that had eaten the Iboga, and that's how the psychoactive properties of Iboga were discovered. So goes the mythology. And the way that they use Iboga there is kind of a like rite of passage initiation, but also to treat various illnesses. the first village that I visited in Cameroon, there was, the shaman is called an Nganga in Gabon and Cameroon. And the Nganga knows when each person in the village is supposed to do their initiation. And that could be anywhere from 6 weeks old baby to someone in their 40s. And the initiation we watched, we saw a woman in her 30s getting initiated, a boy who was about 10 or 11, and a 6-month-old baby. So the Nganga is really the holder of knowledge, and people grow up, even before they do their initiation, everybody in the village eats what's called like a 100 dose of iboga to be a part of the ceremony. So people are very used to, their bodies are very used to working with this medicine, which is a very different kind of scenario than someone going to an Ibogaine clinic and who've never had anything like this before. And I just want to point that out because there's a huge difference between the community using it who is part of their religion and their culture and their practice, and then somebody coming from a Western culture and doing an indigenous medicine. It's a very different thing. And I think that this is something that really needs to be taken into consideration when trying to give these traditional medicines to people in first world countries who don't have experience working with these things. So anyway, each village in Cameroon, Gabon really works with the medicine differently. There's like different sects to Bouiti, and it was really amazing to be able to watch all of the different ways that people use it. And so I just want to jump over to Ibogaine's history. Ibogaine, I think it was like in the 30s and the 40s, France had been using purified Ibogaine extracted from Iboga. By the way, there are 13 alkaloids in Iboga. Ibogaine is just one of them. And France made a medication that was supposed to be used as a kind of stimulant. In very low doses, it kind of has a stimulant-like quality, although I wouldn't compare it to like amphetamines or meth or anything like that. But it makes you alert in a different kind of way. But the psychedelic properties weren't really discovered at that point. This man in the picture, this is Howard Lotzoff. He's considered the father of modern Ibogaine, and the mother is Norma Lotzoff, his wife. And the way that they came across Ibogaine is Howard had a friend working in a chemistry lab who had access to kind of research chemicals, and he gave this Ibogaine stuff to Howard to try. Howard had a heroin habit at the time, took Ibogaine not knowing anything about it, had a really intense visual psychedelic experience, and the next day was not in heroin withdrawal and had no desire to use it. So he gave it to his heroin user friends who had basically the same results. This was quite the discovery. There's nothing else in the world that takes away heroin or opioid withdrawal other than other opioids. So he dedicated his life to working and developing Ibogaine and trying to get it approved in the US and developing treatment around the world. So what is Iboga and Ibogaine? It's not a hallucinogen. A lot of people think that, but it's not. It is an onogen, which puts you into like a dreamlike state where you have a series of visions. It's not like other hallucinogens where you see things with your eyes open, things are moving around you. It's very introspective. It's very much like having a dream, only you're not asleep. You're actually kind of in a weird in-between place. And even though you aren't sleeping, you're getting REM sleep during the Ibogaine experience. Often people after doing Ibogaine only need to sleep a few hours of a night for like the next month sometimes because they've gotten so much REM during the Ibogaine experience. People are responsive on Ibogaine, but they're lying still because, well, the other thing is Ibogaine gives you really severe ataxia, which is an inability to balance. So people are generally lying still because the nausea can be so overwhelming if you move. And if you go to communicate with someone while they're on it, they'll respond. It just might be like kind of a delayed response. So you're not sleeping, you're not awake, you're in this kind of in-between dream state. The way Ibogaine works is it gets processed by the liver into noribogaine, which has been theorized to remain in the body for up to 3 months. It's a K opioid receptor agonist, a U opioid receptor partial agonist, and an SSRI. there is this like theorized, that hasn't been proven, but I've personally experienced it and watched others experienced, this dopamine and serotonin reset. It seems to do something, have some kind of a resetting mechanism. I personally experienced this, like if you compare a heroin and opioid cold turkey detox to the Ibogaine detox, there's really no comparison. Like, you feel inspired and excited about life. A lot of times people's long-term depression will lift, although that's not guaranteed. But there's definitely like this feeling of renewal and a feeling of a lot of weight being lifted off of you that many attribute to something happening with the dopaminergic and serotonergic systems. It also stimulates GDNF, which is something that also hasn't been proven with research completely, but is clearly something that's happening and that needs to be further investigated. Let's see. This is just a little snippet of some of the key researchers, if anybody's interested in looking up the research that's happened so far. Pretty much the main takeaway of most of the research is that Ibogaine reduces or completely halts substance use post-Ibogaine to varying degrees. For some people in the research, they didn't use heroin for the next month and they might have relapsed after that, but their use changes. It's not as destructive. That often happens. And that's important to note, is that success isn't only measured by complete abstinence from drugs. It could mean a lot of different things for people. And sometimes people change their use. And that's a success for some people. For me personally, and I'm going to go into my personal story a little bit later, I left opioids and heroin behind completely. But that's not always the case with everyone, and that's okay. Some people do Ibogaine and continue to relapse and use over the next 5 years, but they still had a great spiritual benefit from the experience they went through. And the way that they use changes, and they don't use as dangerously, and they're aware of something in themselves in a different way. And it's really important to remember that everybody has a very different process, and healing is not always going to be linear. So the focus with Ibogaine has been opioid dependency, because it's, like I said, it's super miraculous. There's nothing else that allows you to skip like 70 to 80% of opioid withdrawal. Experiencing this firsthand is like, I couldn't believe that I wasn't in withdrawal after taking Ibogaine. I had like a huge withdrawal coming to me with the kind of habit that I had. And so this is a huge deal. But it also works for people with other dependencies, not in the same way, but people do it for issues with alcohol. It's not something that you can do right away. People need to detox off of alcohol. And I would say at least a week, probably 2 weeks, have no alcohol in their system. This is because alcohol withdrawal is quite dangerous and you could have a seizure from it. This also goes for benzo withdrawal, which you cannot treat with Ibogaine, by the way. The only way to deal with benzos is a very long, slow, gentle taper. But with alcohol, you can stop it, but go to a detox and make sure you stay off of it for the next few weeks, because it really affects the cardiac system, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And it increases seizure risk, which is super dangerous and fatal when combined with Ibogaine. It does work for stimulants as well. Stimulants, again, you need to have, I would say, 2 weeks off of, because of the way it affects the cardiac system. But I have seen people with all different dependencies and even non-drug dependencies benefit from Ibogaine. I think probably half of the people I helped treat working in clinics were not even addiction-related issues. A lot of people come for dealing with trauma, for dealing with depression, anxiety, and not to say that it just cured people of these things miraculously, but it definitely helped people to have greater insight into the underlying psychological issues. And I've also seen some miraculous things where people had their depression completely lifted, 10 years of depression, and it didn't come back in the same way. Not that they didn't have struggles afterwards, but their depression wasn't debilitating. The important thing to remember is you can't really make guarantees with Ibogaine. It affects everybody so differently. Some people you think are going to do so well with it don't. and seem to have very little benefit. Other people you think, wow, this is going to be a really hard treatment, have miraculous treatments. And so it really varies, and it's important not to set people's expectations too high when they're coming for treatment. I'll talk about that in a little bit. What's the experience like? It's super different for everybody. Some people can tell you really detailed hour-long stories of how they went to Africa, watched a ceremony, talked to their ancestors. Some people relive suppressed childhood trauma. Other people, you know, meet people in the stars. It really varies. And then for me, I basically didn't remember anything. And that also happens. Sometimes people just don't remember anything, or maybe they just have a series of shapes, a series of pictures that seem to have no meaning. So it really varies based on the person. This is a picture I took in Cameroon as well before the ceremony. I'm just going to go over this quickly. There's different styles of dosing. Mainly what people know about is this flood dose, which is a large dose of Ibogaine, which is based off the traditional use from West Central Africa. People usually are given, depending on the clinic, people are given Ibogaine in a few different doses, kind of building up in one night to have one big experience. There's also something that's been developed by Claire Wilkins at Pangeo Biomedics called low-wave dosing. And this is a really revolutionary protocol because it's much more gentle on the system, it's much safer, and it's much easier to integrate. There's people that would be medically ineligible to do Ibogaine because of pre-existing conditions, because of age. But with low-wave dosing, they can do it because it's much, much smaller dosing. It's done over a longer period of time, like 2 to 5 weeks, depending on the dependency or the issue that they're dealing with. And it can work to gradually step people off methadone and Suboxone, which cannot really be treated with a flood. There are clinics, well-renowned clinics, that claim they can treat people from methadone and Suboxone like 4 or 5 days after they've taken their last dose. Those people leave the clinic in withdrawal. I've talked to multiple people who have been treated by these clinics who get sent home sick, and the clinic ignores their complaints. It might take care of some of the withdrawal, but if you only have a few days off methadone and Suboxone before Ibogaine, you are going to be sick for weeks afterward. And so the advice for that is switch to a short-acting opiate for a month before. But that's tricky for people. It's dangerous to tell people to get back on their original opioid of choice, and often it's really hard to find. There's not a lot of doctors in the US. I can count that. I can think of 2 that will switch you from methadone or Suboxone back to like OxyContin or morphine. Doctors are trained not to do that. They'll laugh at you if you ask them to do that because of the way the addiction treatment system is taught in the US. So the other option is go to a clinic like Pangea that does low-wave dosing. You can come down on methadone or Suboxone and get switched to a short-acting opioid there. Like I said, this dosing is super gentle. I've also seen it work on people who are on psychiatric medications. I watched a 67-year-old man come down, I think, on 13 medications and leave on 1 after a month-long treatment. It was amazing, and he would have never been eligible to do a flood dose. So I really want to see low-wave dosing become more practiced by more clinics because it's really safe. And it also, when you get these huge doses of psychedelics that like shoot you to the moon, it's really hard to integrate the experience. It's quite jarring, and often people coming to treatment already have very frazzled nervous systems, and a flood dose can really put them over the edge. I have seen psychiatric emergencies from Ibogaine. Sometimes people don't come back for a week or 2. Not that they're still on the Ibogaine, but they're super dissociated and disconnected from themselves. So the good thing with low wave is you can really gauge how people are reacting and adjust the dose accordingly. And then you're going throughout your daily life, but the Ibogaine is still working in you, so the lessons get brought up gradually and more gently. So I'm a big fan of this, obviously. Then there's microdosing, which Tobias talked about earlier, which is also super beneficial. People that have issues with depression, I've seen just the tiniest pinch of bark or Ibogaine really helps people shift the moods that they're in. There's something that it does in a microdose where you're able to just kind of step outside the way that your brain is kind of obsessively thinking about something or stuck in something. You're able to step outside and watch it rather than participate in it. And that's just with a really small amount. So I think microdosing, although it's not going to kick you're not going to like skip a withdrawal with microdosing. It could help with post-acute withdrawal systems, that's for sure. It'll help with depression, but not really for like a detox. Booster doses are a term that people use for like slightly larger than microdose doses after a flood dose, which helps with residual withdrawals. This is super important. The Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance created the clinical guidelines for Ibogaine-assisted detoxification. The thing with Ibogaine is it is not like other psychedelics. You can die from it, even if you don't have pre-existing medical conditions. There are very serious cardiac side effects, which are, it causes bradycardia, which is a slowed down heart rate. It causes prolonged QT interval, which is basically the space between your heartbeats that it takes for your heart to repolarize the electricity. And if you aren't careful, you can cross the line from prolonged QT interval into a deadly rhythm called torsades, which basically on the EKG looks like this and means cardiac arrest. You're gonna die. So just like any medication in a hospital, and you could die from any medication, you can. But if you know the dosing and you're following protocol and you're ruling out the people that aren't eligible to do it, it is safe. And that's the thing is people get really scared like, ooh, Ibogaine is so dangerous. Well, yes, but if you're following the protocol, it's not. So it's super important to screen people for previously existing cardiac issues. Even a heart murmur is considered too dangerous for a flood dose. Seizure history, you're not really going to be eligible to do Ibogaine with that. Certain severe psychiatric conditions, serious liver conditions, respiratory issues. If you're properly screening people, then you're going to rule out a lot of these incidents that involve previous medical history. The cardiac screening is super important. If somebody is offering to do an Iboga ceremony with you and they ask you, oh, how's your health? Oh, you've never had any health issues before, you're good. If anybody is not asking you for a 12-lead EKG, do not do Iboga or Ibogaine with them. They do not know what they're doing, and it's super dangerous. Yes, people in Gabon and Cameroon do not get EKGs, but they also have thousands of years of working with this medicine. And then Nganga, who lives and has watched people grown up and knows them. When you're going to a clinic, this is not the situation. When you're coming with a serious substance dependency, you already have a weakened system, and you're probably already unhealthy in a lot of ways from not eating properly, from years of drug use. And even if you aren't going for Ibogaine for a drug issue, a lot of people have arrhythmias that they don't know about that aren't dangerous. But arrhythmias that are considered safe and livable in normal people, when you add Ibogaine to the equation, they are not safe. They can be deadly. And so the EKG question is crucial. And I don't care if it's somebody who's traveled around the world giving Iboga ceremonies and they've done 5,000 safe ceremonies with no incidents. Do not go to them if they're not asking for an EKG. The other thing is a liver panel. This is important because if your liver's not working properly, you can't process the Ibogaine into nor-Ibogaine. Metabolic panel is also important. Yeah, and when you arrive at the clinic better be doing a full screen for what drugs are in your system. Because something that I watched happen is somebody came down and didn't divulge their benzodiazepine use properly to us. And the drug test we had tested for everything but benzodiazepines, and it turns out that person was taking Xanax more often than they told us, and they went into a benzo withdrawal seizure during Ibogaine and almost died. So every clinic really needs to have drug tests that test for every drug, especially benzos, because if somebody has benzos in the system, you need to keep administering them throughout the treatment, and it is safe to do that. But if you have to use a specific one value, it has to be at a certain dosage, not under yeah, and throughout the treatments, usually it's like every 20 minutes or half an hour, very dangerous, and you need to stop administering more Ibogaine and potentially might need atropine, although I haven't seen that happen. All clinics should have atropine on hand. Atropine brings the heart rate up to a normal level. Blood pressure also can really tell a lot. If somebody's blood pressure goes up really high or goes really low, something is not right. And you would need to do an EKG on site. All clinics should have an EKG nearby waiting to check to see what's going on in the heart, because things can change really fast with Ibogaine and suddenly someone can be in a deadly rhythm. Let's see. It's really important that people are stabilized before treatment, hydrated, eating properly, using the bathroom properly, electrolyte levels are good. You can't just take somebody off the plane and start giving them Ibogaine. You don't know what's going on with them. There's a lot of these revolving door clinics that want to treat you in 3 to 4 days, get you in, get you out. And that is just not safe. You don't know what people are coming down with, what kind of what their health situation is like, especially people using drugs have not been eating or drinking properly for months, years maybe. So people need to be, your body really needs to be in tip-top shape to do Ibogaine because of the cardiac risks. You need to be super healthy. So just to illustrate what I'm talking about with these risks, I'll go into my story a little bit. I did Ibogaine in 2011. I had been using mainly fentanyl, but also like whatever other opioid I can find. I was living in Bogota, Colombia at the time, and could buy whatever I wanted over the counter, opioid rise, which was quite the discovery for an opioid enthusiast. So I kind of had unlimited access and got a really, really high tolerance with fentanyl. That's another thing. It's not a good idea for people to be using fentanyl up until Ibogaine because it has cardiac side effects as well, QT prolongation. So I was using fentanyl up until I left. The guy who was treating me knew that. He told me 3 days before to switch to another opioid. I don't think I did. I think maybe the day before I did. But anyways, it really should have been 2 weeks without fentanyl. So I flew, this clinic was in Guatemala City. So I flew to Guatemala City. I arrived on a Friday night. They told me that they'd never treated a tolerance as high as mine opioid-wise, even though I was basically like 105 pounds. Somehow I had the highest tolerance they'd ever seen. And they started giving me Ibogaine in less than 24 hours. So clearly the problems were they didn't stabilize me. I wasn't hydrated or eating properly or any of that. And I wasn't going to the bathroom properly as well because opioids cause severe digestive issues and constipation. So they really rushed into my treatment. They started giving me Ibogaine in the evening. My withdrawal didn't go away like it should. They kept giving me more Ibogaine. They also started giving me Valium, which I think might be part of why I don't remember anything. And I don't know how long later, but I remember waking up and being really sick and throwing up. The next thing I know, I had like, instead of having like a blackout, I had a whiteout where everything turned white. I remember that being very distinctive. I woke up with 2 nurses trying to find a vein in me for an IV for like 15 minutes. They were poking every vein in my body, but they were completely flat and they couldn't get in anything. I had a really bad looking EKG. Finally, a paramedic arrived and we started trying to go to hospitals. We went to the state Guatemalan hospital, which didn't want to take me. They don't know what Ibogaine is, and they didn't believe I had a bad EKG because I was 27 years old and I looked mostly healthy. We went to a second hospital, which turned us away. We went to a third hospital, which took me, but it was like a very unexperienced doctor, kind of looked at my EKG confused, doesn't know what Ibogaine is. My EKG got a little better, and so they sent us home. So I go back to the clinic, and they did another EKG. It looked really bad. I was basically going in, my QT was so long that I was starting to go into torsade. So we rushed to a fourth hospital who also wasn't taking it seriously, but then started taking it seriously when I hit the floor and had my first cardiac arrest. I ended up having 6 cardiac arrests over, I think it was 12 hours. I don't remember, I wasn't conscious. And then the hospital didn't have the proper staff. There was no cardiologist. They also didn't have an external pacemaker. So the doctor running the clinic had to like assemble a team of friends of his that are cardiologists to come to the hospital that they didn't work at. And one of them brought a pacemaker from home. So because my heart rate wouldn't go back to normal, they did an external pacemaker. It was basically like a box and a cord running under my collarbone into my heart to make sure it was beating. This happens because Ibogaine is a hERG channel blocker, potassium hERG channel blocker. Your heart cannot beat without potassium. So as long as Ibogaine is in your system, it's going to continue to do this function. In my case, I had way too much Ibogaine in my system. The guy treating me seemed to think he had some kind of shamanic, magical understanding of dosing, which I see a lot in Ibogaine and in the greater psychedelic world. And I'll talk about this later, the shaman complex issue that's really dangerous. So he seemed to think that he could eyeball out the dose, so he wasn't even weighing it. The only way we knew how much Ibogaine I had gotten is because he looked at his supply and said, okay, it was a little bit over 2 grams, which when you do the math for that is about 40 milligrams per kilo. That's almost double the amount of Ibogaine that you should ever really give anybody. The most I've seen given to someone when I was working was, I think, 24 milligrams per kilo. So anybody getting the dose I got would have ended up in the hospital. It's not because Ibogaine is inherently dangerous, it's because I got overdosed. Also, I was a bit unhealthy and not stabilized, which didn't help this situation at all. So that's what happened. The potassium couldn't reach my heart because there was so much Ibogaine in my system. The clinic doctor had no idea because he wasn't properly educated on Ibogaine research, which is really scary. They came up with all these crazy theories as to what happened to me. They were convinced I had taken something I didn't tell them about, which wasn't true. And a year later at my first Ibogaine conference, I find out about this potassium hERG channel thing. And it was Dr. Ken Alper who explained it very clearly what happened to me. It wasn't like something so outlandish or crazy. If you had read basic Ibogaine research, you would understand what had happened. So yeah, I was in the hospital, I think, for about 2 weeks on an external pacemaker. Eventually they turned it off. My heart was completely normal. It's still normal. I've had like full, like I've walked around with a Holter for 24 hours. I've done echocardiogram. There's no damage. It doesn't damage your heart. It's just that the potassium was being blocked to my heart. What happened to me is completely avoidable. I'm not saying this story to scare people off Ibogaine. This is like, I think there's only me and one other person who's ended up on a pacemaker because of dangerous, unsafe practitioners not following the clinical safety protocols. So this is not a common thing. It's completely avoidable with proper medical screening, with stabilization, and with really carefully following the dosing. And dosing gently and dosing a little bit at a time and watching how people react and continuing to monitor vital signs and EKG. This picture in the middle is me in the hospital with a million wires running under my collarbone that I still have scars from, surgically implanted intravenous line, external pacemaker. I was looking a little out of it, but actually, even though all this crazy stuff happened, I woke up in the hospital feeling amazing. Like I kind of didn't care what had happened to me, honestly. I think it probably traumatized the guys treating me and my family more than I did. I woke up just feeling astounded that I wasn't in withdrawal. I felt so positive and inspired about life. And the biggest thing Ibogaine did for me was that it showed me that all of my years of struggling with drugs was actually my training to do the work that I was meant to do. I still refer to the 7 years I had with opioids as my internship. It was like after all this time where society, the addiction treatment system, was telling me that I was being destructive, that I should feel guilty and ashamed of the things I had been through. Suddenly that was completely gone, and I saw all of my experiences going to jail, overdoses, all of it. I saw it as really important training for the work I'm going to do now. And that's what's amazing about Ibogaine is it helps you to see your experiences in a different way and to really use them for your future work. So I knew right away that I wanted to work with Ibogaine, like just like that, laying in the hospital then, and I was like on a mission from there. So this is a guide that I co-authored.
Hey,
Yes.
Juliana. We do have to jump off soon. We're running a little bit behind. I was hoping that either we can possibly
Can I
ask
just,
a
I
question.
actually have just a few more points that I want to hit, and I'll go through them quickly,
Okay,
and then I'll
sounds
jump to
good.
questions, okay?
Okay,
Yeah. So this is a guide that I co-authored with Shay Pruger, Guide to Finding a Safe Ibogaine Clinic. It's on my website. And if you use this guide, you're going to weed out a lot of unsafe clinics. I highly suggest using it. I usually don't recommend specific clinics, but I send them this guide instead. I'm just going to mention this quickly. I think it's really dangerous when clinics view substance abuse and addiction as through the lens of like 12-step philosophies and the disease concept. It's super stigmatizing. It makes people feel like they're going to be the same forever. And the reality is people are constantly evolving and changing and pushing these narratives of like clean and dirty and sober and recovery onto people. For me, it felt super stigmatizing and it made me feel really stuck. I don't describe myself as an addict. That phase of my life is done. I've evolved as a person. I know for some people those terms are helpful, but for me they're not. And I think working in an Ibogaine clinic, it's important to let the person define for themselves what they want their healing to look like. Not completely abstinence, not going to meetings for the rest of their life. That's not the right thing for everybody. So I really encourage clinics to work with people and meet people where they're at. I'm just going to jump to the importance of preparation and integration with Ibogaine is crucial. You can't just expect to throw psychedelics at people and that it's going to do the work. Psychedelics are merely a door opener. It takes a lot of work to integrate the lessons afterwards. I think in our society, there's a view that there's just one magical thing that will fix something in us, but really it takes years of work of healing. And the danger in the psychedelic community is focusing too much on the medicines and not enough on the work afterwards. So in my business, Inner Vision, I'm really focusing on supporting people in preparation and to integrate those things afterwards. This is just a little glimpse of some of the dangerous and unstable practices in the community. This is a guy called Johnny the Healer who advertises himself in this really unrealistic, the most exclusive healing center. You know, there's a lot of this happening in the Ibogaine community where people just show up with money and they want to open a clinic and they don't have proper training or experience and they claim to be an authority and they have this kind of like shaman complex where they think that they can have some magical power to heal people. Only people can heal themselves. What you're doing is providing a safe space to support that. Anybody claiming that they have like magical healing powers, I would seriously question that and really look at why you're trying to get somebody outside of you to heal you. Only you can do the work on that. There is a huge problem in the Ibogaine world of people not being held accountable for abusive practices. There is rape, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse that happens. There's a lot of these clinics that are run by white men who don't have trauma-informed training, who don't have training to work with women. And I constantly hear these really scary stories. And because Ibogaine operates outside of any certification body or any kind of body that can enforce safe practices, anything goes, and it's quite dangerous. So one thing that I'm working on doing right now is, I'm just gonna go out of this screen share. One thing that I'm working on doing right now with a collective of women in the community is setting up a system of accountability and training. My hope for the future is that there will be a certification body that will offer a training, a monitoring, a supervision process to make sure clinics are operating safely. It's going to be like a challenge and a long-term project to try and enforce something like this, but anybody working that's in charge of somebody's safety, physical, medical safety, and psychological safety needs to be under some kind of supervision by somebody who's trained. It's just like any therapist in the US, you're under supervision of somebody with more experience and more training. So what our collective really wants to work to do is to set up a training that focuses on trauma-specific training, women's working with women and the trauma that is unique to women, working with marginalized populations, people of color, and the trauma from racism that is specific to them. There needs to be training on how to work with this individual trauma. You can't just count on Ibogaine to do this work. You have to know how to be able to support people. It's super important. There's also an issue just in general, not just in the Ibogaine world, but in the psychedelic world, of people who show up with money and haven't taken the time to actually learn about the history of the community, learn from the people who've been working in the community for years. They think they can show up with money, put on events, and not have taken the time to learn, to listen, to ask questions. I also think it's really problematic that at this conference, for example, there are no Indigenous voices. We're talking about traditional medicines that have thousands of years of use, and we can't just show up as white people and suddenly claim to be the experts and co-opt these medicines to do the things that only we're interested in. That's a continuation of colonizing practices. And I just want to encourage anybody involved in psychedelics not to continue these tactics of colonization and abusive practices. You have to spend time learning from the people who know these medicines. There's still so much more that I need to learn. Like, I don't know, I'm not claiming to be the holder of how to enter the psychedelic community in the right way, but I do have some questions, serious questions to ask for people in this community who show up and claim to be authorities and try to have power and throw events without doing the proper research and taking the time to properly learn. One more thing that I just want to add is I just want to make a call to community members of the psychedelic community to be loud and speak up when you see something that isn't right, and support the creation of systems of accountability. I want to make a call for people who are new to the psychedelic space to do research, talk to members of the community, spend a year or more listening and participating before curating events or claiming to be some kind of authority. This isn't just a business. We're trying to address thousands of years of trauma due to systems of racism, oppression, genocide, and colonization. Don't show up to the community like a colonizer and just take what you want and what is easiest for you. We need to be in communication with Indigenous voices, people of color, to learn what's actually needed in the community. If you're here to make money, you're contributing to systems of repression. If you're going to address healing, then you have to talk about the systems and societies that people live in. You can't just treat people as isolated. People have mental health issues, and it's not just because of their individual experience, it's because of the abusive society we live in. So if we want to approach healing in any context, we have to talk about the systems that people live in. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. And I understand that we are low on time, so I would love to go to some questions.
Hey, Juliana, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, and in regards to Indigenous voices, the few that we knew were unavailable due to either partaking in the Black Lives Matter movement or in COVID-related problems out in Peru, as well as other parts of the world. But it is something that we're actively working to do. So if you'd like to be part of a committee going into next year for the conference, that's something that we're actively seeking folks for to help us gather some of those individuals. Yeah, and we would really appreciate anyone in the audience listening to help us out, because we know that it's something that we can do better in, and unfortunately the circumstances of today made that less possible than it could have been, but we want to do even better for next year. But thank you. Let's see, I don't see any audience questions, but there was one thing that I wanted to ask is, I think that oftentimes, we've heard from several individuals talking about Ibogaine specifically throughout the conference, and most of the time the conversation revolves around helping individuals move away from opioid addiction or a variety of different substance dependencies. I was wondering if there's, kind of like a second place demographic focused around an ailment that you think Ibogaine is also really effective for treating outside of dependencies, and why that, I guess, demographic hasn't necessarily been talked about as much, if that is one that exists.
Like I mentioned, Ibogaine also gets, I would say half the people I have helped treat were dealing with PTSD, trauma, depression. I would say specifically PTSD is Ibogaine is super beneficial for, because the main thing that Ibogaine does for everybody is it brings up deeply buried and deeply embedded traumas and helps you to look at them. I don't know how to compare it to MDMA for PTSD because I haven't worked with that specifically, but pretty much everyone I've helped treat has done some degree of dealing with various degrees of PTSD. I also am talking about PTSD not just as a diagnosis, but the PTSD that we all have, because we've all been through trauma on some level. Yeah, trauma, PTSD.
Yeah, and one question from the audience, we can close out on this, is whether the guide you've created gives locations for specific providers.
No, my guide is specifically made to empower people to find the clinic that's right for them. I do have like 3 clinics that I recommend sometimes to close friends and family members. Honestly, I wouldn't ever send anyone to 80 to 90% of the clinics that exist because they're not operating safely. The reason I don't always like to recommend the clinics specifically is because I think it's really important for people to be engaged in finding their treatment and to become educated about what they're getting themselves into. I also don't want to be liable for somebody's experience by making that recommendation. That's another issue. But what I found is that when people use the guide, they're really able to find a treatment provider that they feel comfortable with and that they connect with and that is operating safely. It's very empowering for people to go through the process themselves.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, be well.